Okay, so let's get rolling. Welcome to the Metabolic Museum-University and the launch of the website and the first debating chamber. My name is Clémentine Deliss. I'm the director of the Metabolic Museum-University, or abbreviated the mm-u, and I'm associate curator at KW Institute for Contemporary Art here in Berlin, where I have been working on the development of the Metabolic Museum-University for 3 years, and I'm deeply grateful to everybody at KW for enabling this to take place. I'm also a guest professor at the University of Art in Kassel, and I have a very poncy title in Cambridge, which is Global Humanities Professor in History of Art at the University of Cambridge. There you go. I would like to explain, first of all, perhaps, what is the Metabolic Museum-University and why these two institutions? Why museum, why university? After I left the Weltkulturen Museum in 2015, I had set up an experimental laboratory for the remediation of collections largely contentiously acquired, a laboratory that included artists and thinkers and lawyers and researchers. I wanted to continue working with the idea that if you brought collections out of their respective disciplinary holes and brought them into assemblages with a group of people from different disciplines, you might be able to create a new transversal methodology. And I thought to myself, okay, universities, art schools, to get into them, to study there or to teach, you need to have the requisite diplomas. You can't just walk into the university in Frankfurt and say, hey, I'm from here and I'm going to teach. Or, hey, I'm a student and I'm a nice person, but I don't have the diploma, let me in. And it occurred to me that the only democratic intellect that can be nurtured in a civic institution today is the museum. And so I began to think, how could the museum maybe move away from its earlier roots from the 19th century, where it was so close to a department store, where people walk through, they remain upright, they look, they go, they consume the works, they go out, pass a shop, they buy things in the shop, they go and have a drink and they leave. How one could decelerate this process and look at the museum really as a location for self-education in the most intense sense of the term, not as a kind of superficial educational program, but where you would actually create the dispositif necessary for people to work and study and reflect on the basis of a kind of extended visual thinking. A visual thinking, because when we are dealing with art, we cannot really avoid the question of the visual, of the iconological. And I therefore decided to continue working on different platforms, understanding these platforms as exercises, not as grand institutions, but as a series of tests in different places. And the motto of the Metabolic Museum-University is effectively that to enter a museum, you do not need an exam. The heart of the Metabolic Museum, its organs, so to speak, are collections. And these are collections that have very often been sectioned by disciplinary categories. So you will have collections that are considered to be art history, or others that are considered to be anthropology or architecture. And I feel very strongly about the fact that we see only a small amount of these collections in exhibitions that are usually thematic or are catering to a public desire of the moment, but that there is a lot of material that is sequestered, that is dormant, that is unexplored, sometimes that has been collected and never shown at all, never engaged with. And that these secondary dormant collections are the potential for a future transversal method, a decolonial process that would allow us to develop new systems of interpretation. Systems isn't a nice word, but even to create new contexts. You know, context is always connected to a discipline. Do you have the right context? It's quite forbidding in a way. And I am interested in the fact that these collections are like stored code. They have potential. They are what I call prototypes. The moment you recognize one of the artifacts in some obscure collection somewhere, you can ask yourself, is it still generative? Can we still learn from it? Is there a beauty in it? And so I believe that alongside restitution, which is absolutely necessary, alongside provenance studies and object biographies, today we also need access to all these different collections, very often secondary, very often in duplicate form, and that together with a curatorial platform such as the Metabolic Museum-University, we can begin to break down the classifications that have been so powerful in our ways of understanding the world. And one example of this, I guess, in an indirect way and dealing with the question of the prototype, is the exhibition that I've just curated at KW in Berlin called Skin in the Game. And there I asked 6 artists, Ruth Buchanan, Ottobong Nkanga, Collier Shaw, Rosemary Trockel, Joël Tuerlings and Andrea Zittel, to give me that prototype, that unfinished business that keeps coming back in their work, that is like a revenant, that has a potentiality that they can't hold back, and to ask them to let us see this work that is usually very intimate and part of their own archival process. The MMU has a changing faculty every year, and this year, 2023, I'm really delighted that the faculty that is going to present itself to you now is made up of people who have followed and accompanied the MMU ever since its beginnings. And I'm totally delighted that they are now here together with us and ready to steer the ship forward. So I'd like to hand over my microphone to Winnie Xu.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, what an exciting, new beginning for the online launch of MMU. Anyways, by the way of introduction, my name is Winnie Xu. I studied my bachelor's in art history at the University of Cambridge, where I led the Decolonized Art History group, and consequently, this is how I met Clémentine and heard more about the past activities of Metabolic Museum-University. During my time at Cambridge, I also focused on creating events connecting the Cambridge art historians with the decolonial artistic practices, elsewhere in London and in Europe. And there, I also completed my dissertation in artist books. Since then, I've decided to pivot my sort of journey for a bit, and right now I'm pursuing a master's in management at London School of Economics, where I'm studying economics and finance to understand how business works. Part of how this linked to Metabolic Museum-University is this aspect of transversality, where I want to find analogies from more established industries to make, hopefully at some point, the creative industry more sustainable. And yeah, I'm very excited to join MMU to explore the potentials of not-for-profit organizations with a mission in art education. And I foresee a role focusing on logistics and operations for myself. And now I pass on to my colleague, Ollie George.
Hey, thank you, Winnie. Yeah, my name is Ollie George. I'm a designer, writer, and researcher based in Berlin. Currently, I handle research and communications for Studio Thomas Saraceno, and I also co-convene a curriculum collective called Archive for the 11th Hour, through which I develop research that entangles questions of the immaterial, spectral, and sonic. And it's also the reason that I connected with Clémentine and the MMU, and all the visions and visceralities that it proposes. I pass on to Joanna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Wona. Thanks to everyone for coming and attending this event. I'm a visual artist based in Hamburg, and I study at the moment at the University of Fine Arts here in my master's. And next to my theory or research-based interests, my praxis also includes sculpture, installation, painting, and text-based work. And what I also do consider a part of my practice, though, is being based in collaborative projects, mostly self-organized. But anyways, I'm just very happy to be here and be part of the faculty. And as for my connection to Clémentine, next to assisting her in a grade seminar actually on decolonial practices when she was a guest professor at the university in Hamburg, I've also been involved in past projects of hers, like, for example, the Home Museum website for the Lagos Photo Festival in 2020 within the cooperative Birds of Knowledge. And so right now I'm just looking forward to work and to create and to discuss within this institution. I hope everyone can gain a lot from tonight, and I want to pass on to Jakob.
Hello, my name's Jakob Kapus. I studied also in Hamburg together with Joanna, and that's also where I met Clémentine, and I've been since then also involved in the Metabolic Museum-University and project like Home Museum. And over the last year, I've been working on this website and been assisting in the development of it. And 2 years ago, I filmed the debating chamber on prototypes and ominous objects together with Thais Nepomuceno, and the resulting filmic reportage is now on show in Skin in the Game. Projected out of one of those metabolic chairs that are around in the exhibition. And yes, and now I pass on to, I think, Toby, but I'm not sure.
I can jump in. So my name's Toby Upson. I'm probably the least exciting member of the faculty. I'm a writer currently based in London. I recently graduated from the Royal College of Art, where my research and sort of my thinking focused on the critical potentials of creative analogy and aphrasis. I first got engaged with Clémentine and the Metabolic Museum-University in 2019 with its iteration in Ljubljana. At the time, I was working for Arts Council England, that, if you don't know, is one of the largest public funders in the UK. I was specifically working there within their museums and cultural policy departments. I subsequently left Arts Council and started working for a commercial gallery. And that probably says a lot about the state of public funding in the UK. I'm now going to pass on to Eddie.
Thanks, Toby. Hey, everyone. My name is Edi Vinani, and I'm an artist and designer currently based in Berlin and Copenhagen. I mainly work in close collaboration with other artists and scholars on publications, exhibitions, or, like in this case, educational programs. Like Ollie, I'm also a part of the collective Archive for the 11th Hour, where we often address problems of the archive and ethnological collections. And I have a special interest in sounds and sonics from Southeast Asia, which brought me more recently to the MMU. And now let's hear Felipe.
Hi, everyone. My name is Felipe Maris. I'm an artist and cultural anthropologist based in New York. I'm currently visiting faculty at Cooper Union, teaching photography. And I am working on turning my dissertation project into a book. And it explores the material effects of technological representations of cultural artifacts, as well as the ethics of technological representations of cultural artifacts. And by cultural artifacts here, I mean both artworks as well as objects that fall into the category of ethnographic artifacts. And a central question of my research is how that boundary came to be historically and technologically, and how it's maintained and for what purpose and serving what interests. And during my research, I got to know Clémentine's work, and I also had the chance to work with her when she invited me to be faculty at the Ljubljana Biennial as well. And back then, I think we had the chance to explore some of the questions that interest me in regards to technological representations of artifacts inside a museum. I'm very excited to be here in this new iteration of the MMU, and I'm particularly excited because it brings many of the questions of representation to a technological environment. And so I'm very much looking forward to how the project will unfold.
I believe that I will close around quickly. Hello, my name is.
Yes,
Thanks,
sorry.
My name is Christina Scheib. I'm a curator based in Berlin, and I studied at the University of Arts and Design, and that's in Karlsruhe, where I met Clémentine, and where we began working on the Metabolic Museum-University iteration in Ljubljana, and yeah, made it happen in 2019. I'm currently the curator of 2 exhibition spaces at the University of Arts in Bremen, and that's also where I will begin teaching this semester. I'm very much looking forward to that. But for now, let's get started.
Okay, so let me introduce you to the Metabolic Museum-University website. I should add that before the pandemic, the original plan for KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, was to bring together a faculty and to start to lift the lid off the crypts in the various collections in Berlin. Not necessarily museum collections, but university research collections that had fallen out of date, or neighborhood museum collections, or private collections that were sitting there and not really being looked at as much as they might be, and to set up assemblages of these artworks and artifacts, in particular those, and this is a kind of an interesting point, that evoked contention. Contention is something that is particularly useful as an identifier when you walk into a collection of a museum or of a university and you ask the custodian, the curator there, what they feel is contentious. It's a fast track into a large amount of material if you're not really entirely sure what it is you're looking for. Effectively, you're looking for artifacts that have a live wire, that are prototypes, but sometimes this question of contention throws up a lot of interesting discussions. Now, the idea was then, having identified different prototypes that were potentially contentious, was to squat existing exhibitions, both at KW and at partner venues, and to set up ultra-temporary exhibitions of 3 hours in which the host exhibition would welcome guest foreign objects, so to speak. They would come in and they would be debated in a debating chamber that would be semi-public, semi-private, maybe with if it developed well, then it would be entirely public, but it would also create a kind of a bouncing effect in relation to the exhibit that was already there. And so it had this possibility of reigniting an exhibition after a couple of weeks or a month of its presentation. But the pandemic hit us, and the faculty at the time, that included Matthias Brun, Augustin Morse, the composer, Tom McCarthy, Henrike Naumann, Luke Willis-Thompson, who I see is here with us today, Bless, Margareta von Oswald, Christabel Stewart, and Chris Krauthausen, had to literally relocate online. And since then, the option of working with collections online became a reality, and I realized we would need a virtual venue, something like an experimental museum university with which to create our own configurations of collections that we had photographed, and to work together on a transversal approach to their interpretation. So not to wait for access any longer, but to do it with what we had already accumulated as different researchers and artists and even lawyers. So what we're launching today took 1 year to prepare, and I'm deeply indebted to Jakob Karpus for supporting the development of this website. I'm also very, very grateful to the website designers, Karan Köbel, Rana Karan and Cécile Köbel. Again, both of them studied with Christina at the University of the Arts in Karlsruhe and were responsible for the logo that you see behind us that was already developed in 2019. And I can't say how much I appreciate what they have done. The website programmers, Happy Server, Dylan Spencer Davidson and Michael Derringer have begun working with us from scratch. And, you know, I'm not the kind of person who makes websites every week. There are others who do, but I don't. And so the idea of translating all the physical dimensions of the Metabolic Museum-University into the virtual sphere was very challenging for me. And I'm very grateful to their patience. The mm-u.online contains information on all the previous exercises of the MMU since 2015. In particular, what is important about it, perhaps we could move to the different organs. There you go, you see, you go down the intestine and then you see here all the different organs. And what is interesting here is that maybe if we click onto the School of Remediation, which was the very first meeting which took place in Kiev, in Ukraine, is that, stop for a second, we can see that the concepts, that the website, unlike a lot of websites, it actually contains all the early concept notes. So it's not just the polished, published material, it's all the questions that are raised prior to the dissemination of a project. And I think that's important. It makes the website much more raw. So let me show you some of the images of the photographic reportage of the School of Remediation. It took place here in a building which I hope is still standing. It's the Museum of the History of Ukraine in Kiev, the National Museum of the History of Ukraine. And what I did was to ask visitors to the museum if they wanted to accompany me to Kiev's markets and to, again, using this quick, fast, and important approach to look at objects that they felt might appear contentious. So we gathered in the museum here. At the top of the stairs, just after you walked in, there was a table, and we started analyzing artifacts that everybody had bought with their own money. You can see the word prototype, contraband, practices, objects. Things are starting already there, this whole question of contraband, if you like. And here you can see us debating. So these were seminars that took place every day in the museum. Visitors could walk in and sit down. They could listen. They could involve themselves in the debates around why certain objects were contentious. And maybe at this point, I'm going to hand over to Felipe, who will show you how I-Day took place in Ljubljana. Thank you.
Hello again. And so I-Day was my contribution to the previous iteration, which I referred to earlier. And if we look at the images, I would like to emphasize how much the projects that I was presenting that day, which I titled Brute Force, after an algorithm that measures light and how to represent light in 3D renderers, is in a sense brought to life in the website, or at least that is our hope, our ongoing, I would say, our ongoing mission or guide in the sense that to embed artifacts and artworks into technological representations is to further contribute to their material histories, their value, and their meaning. And in order to affect how that meaning can be perceived, it needs to, we have to actively participate into that development. And I think through the website, we intend to explore technology as a process that can actually be used for that purpose, in a sense, to reshape perhaps how certain artifacts are perceived or how they circulate. And the last, I think, point that I wanted to make is that the website, as it stands, I see it as also in ongoing development, which is something that excites me about this particular form, is that unlike a traditional museum, we have more flexibility in terms of rearranging and reorganizing ideas and our quote unquote spaces. So with that, I would like to pass back to Clémentine.
Great. And now just to show you very quickly, so we move on faster. I want to show you the debating chamber that was held at KW, and just click on a filmic reportage. So there are films as well, and maybe just let you have a minute of this reportage made by Jacob Karpus. Do you want to move some things or take some things away?
Really push you.
I
mean, that's what I would do. Like,
would you want to push a few things?
Push everything. Let's do what you want.
I mean, it's more than I want. If you don't do it helps us. I think
we can put it back again. We don't know.
Sure. Be careful, please. Be careful. Some of these are really fragile. The three pieces here. Hendrix. Yeah.
These ones should get eaten. Don't do that again. So you just want the box and the liver, that's it?
This gives you a sense of an experimental assemblage and the way that lawyers and writers and artists can come together and talk about what is on this table and bring their own competence, if you like, into play, rather than a fixed idea of what the context of each object needs to be. So let's look at the other areas of the website. Now move to the library, please. And in the library, you have stacked according to title, so the A to Z of titles. You have different years you can look under. You have the different formats. There you go, right through to audio. And you have the faculty and authors. So the faculty can also upload its own published material. And this is really useful if you're doing teaching with the Metabolic Museum-University. Okay, and now I'd like to show you how the reservoir works, because this is really important. And it's to be used for programming, so programming classes, working with collections and with the Bureau d'Esprit, which we're going to come to next. So let me pass on to Eddie.
Thanks, Clémentine. So yeah, now we are entering the reservoir. It's the MMU's own collection of photographs, video and audio files, and it's only accessible for members of the MMU for use in research, but also especially for our notion of visual thinking within the individual Bureau d'Esprit, which we will also introduce in a bit. It mainly contains documentation of visits, or as we call it, field work, to different museums and their objects and storage spaces from all over the world. So if we get back to the top, similar, we can, exactly, no, just to make it clear that it's similar, like with the library, that we can sort it by year, but also by location, or we can also use the search function. As we are talking so much about organs and metabolisms, I would suggest that we check out the Museum for Medical History in Hamburg. Yes. So as you can see, a lot of insights to the storage of the museum, its interiors, to objects that are merely hidden here and not part of the public exhibitions. We can click on on images, then we can zoom in. If we click on it again, and click out of it, we can swipe through the images. We want to, yeah, exactly. And a very important function is that we can also add them to our selection by clicking on the plus button on the upper right for our personal selection and later use in research and in our bureau. Maybe I would say let's check out some more collections, like, for instance, let's go to Lisbon, to the Museu Nacional de Etnologia. I remember it's also more mask-like objects, like similar what we've seen before. And yeah, let's click on that. And maybe one more. Let's go to the Senckenberg Naturmuseum, for instance, back to Frankfurt. So a lot of objects from the storages. Maybe there's a particular thing that interests us. Maybe a monkey that is pickled, or a snake. Yeah. Let's add this. Okay. And then we can go out, and then let's click on My Selection. And yeah, here we can see now all the images we added, and maybe here you can see already some synergies happening between the images. And yeah, now how to use this selection in a Bureau d'Esprit. And for further exploration, we'll tell you Ollie.
Hey, yes. Thanks, Eddie. So yeah, so the Bureau d'Esprit, they are conceived of as virtual studio spaces, let's say. We offer them to willing participants for a fixed time-limited period. Bureaus are by default private spaces, much like a lockable studio room, accessible only on invitation. So inside the Bureau is a set of functionalities and tools that have been developed to facilitate the transversal visual thinking we're talking about. So image, video, sound, text all become actionable on this canvas-based interface, allowing its user to butt the heads of their chosen materials together in ways that might be associative or adversarial. Screenshots, clippings, GIFs, field recordings, gossip, media can all be constellated into zones. The blue color you see is one that I've selected. I'm using mine to gather the bones of an essay that I continue to procrastinate writing on the specter of a sonic monument and the possible forms its body might take. One key feature I'd like to draw your attention to is the connection made to the MMU's Reservoir. So what's offered is the ability to drop in material that Eddie had collected from the Reservoir. Maybe we can show this. But in general, yeah, it's good. It's important to say that people are invited to make use of the bureaus in any way they see fit, and to make use of the resources that the website contains. And so the result is a space in progress, the internal workings of its occupant's mind. Yeah.
Sorry.
That sounds good. That sounds really good. So I think now, Christina, we're going to move on to the debating chamber.
Exactly. Just before we start our very first debating chamber, I want to just inform you, if you want to get in touch with us and receive news and updates about the upcoming events, please sign up for our newsletter or just write us an email. Our address is info@mm-u.online. And you can also follow us on Instagram. It's right there. Our account name is called @Metabolic Museum-University. And yeah, we look very much forward to embark on these events with you all together.
Okay, exciting. Let's kick off the debating chamber. This is Joanna again. And I will be your timekeeper today for the debating chamber. As for context, so debating chambers, or with debating chambers, we seek to push the boundaries of contextual information, meaning in and around art, and all this is happening while centering visual thinking. So before we start, it's important that I will explain our house rules. I will inform you on the procedures. I'm the person who's kind of trying to organize who is speaking, and so let's get into that. Debating chambers, first of all, will be an ongoing format. There will be more debating chambers coming. And then also, as you might have noticed, the debating chambers will be recorded. So you will find the records of the debating chambers, meaning the visual provocations you will see, and the video recording online after each event has finished. And you will also see when a new event is coming up, of course, and will be able to sign up. So as for the recording, there is also the possibility, if it has been discussed previously, to leave out certain parts of what has been brought up during the live event in the recordings that will be publicly accessible. So that means being here live can mean that you have access and insights that might be sort of a sensitive content that will not be made public. And this is also because the debating chambers are supposed to be a space for thought experiments as well. And as for chronology, today we have 3 provocators, which I will announce in a second. And they each received access to work in a bureau d'esprit to guide us through their provocations visually. So they will each have 7 minutes, which I will time, to present their provocation. But we also have a duo today. So one provocateur will have 7 minutes, and then we have a 14-minute presentation as well. And then afterwards, we have our 2 saboteurs, which will be Clémentine and Winnie, who will have 5 minutes to scrutinize each provocation. So they reflect on their own stance regarding the theme, and then generally mediate today's discussion between all parties involved. So, and after that, we then have one more planned, a chance for the provocateurs to respond, just very briefly, 2-3 minutes maybe. And then finally, we will open up the whole discussion, publicly, meaning to everyone who's here right now. And the audience can now get involved. So one more information on the audience. We have placed so-called stool pigeons within the audience. These are people we can turn to who have thoughts on the subject and are ready to intervene and might come in. And for the public discussion, we would really welcome everyone to turn on their camera as soon as this happens. If you have any questions, we also ask you to not use the chat because we want to be involved in the discussion and we want to talk to each other. And that just works much more if we talk to each other personally and speak. So you can definitely raise your hand if you like. On the bottom of the meeting window, there's like a reaction icon that you can click, and I will do my best to keep a list, bring you in, and then please also state your full name when you're speaking. And of course, this is an event. This is like a live event. So I have no problem if you sort of pull me from my job and just speak. You're very welcome to do that. And please keep your microphones also muted unless you enter the debate. And then as a last point, we really want to encourage sort of theatrical reactions. So if you agree, you're very welcome to nod. If not, you can shake your head, keeping everyone motivated in a way. And just creating communication between everyone that is not just verbal, but also physical. And yes, that was all regarding house rules. So our theme today is risk and transgression in curatorial practice. So we're going to look at, for example, questions like whether it's possible to break the current normativity we're experiencing, in which exhibitions are curated to align with consumerist interests and prioritizing public opinion maybe, or how artists and curators can work together outside the confines of institutions without compromising the intention of their own work. And today's provocators are people who themselves are taking risks as curators. And I'm very happy and delighted to introduce Daphne Ayaz, Pierre-Alexandre Mathieu, and Charles Tessou. Thank you for being here. Really looking forward to your provocations, and I would like to give you the floor now to introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. Brilliant initiative. Thank you for having me here. I wish I met you all before. But anyway, I'm doing an exhibition with Sarkis end of the month, who thought a lot about related topics of the MMU. And I think your input would be amazing to connect the older generation who thought a lot about looting histories and concepts like light shots and creek shots over the past 5 decades, and have your input to carry it on to the next generations. I'm here to play today. I'm not sure if I'm provocative. I'm not sure if my pigeon stools, what they're going to do, or the two stools pigeons will do with me. I have no idea. I love the spirit of the whole initiative, so I'm here to support. My blessings. I'm happy to do my 7 or 8 minute provocation shortly.
Hi, everyone. We first wanted to thank Clémentine and all the team of MMU for the invitation. I mean, the presentation was really impressive, especially the kind of archives of collections. So I'm Charles, and on my right is Pierre. And so we are independent curators since now 10 years, working together. And recently we have been writing a book on, titled Cruising Pavilion, on the history of sex club, its architecture, and its influence on the history of forms, that will be published by Spectre Books and Laed. And we just did our first musical at Bourse de Commerce last month in Paris, which was like the encounter of the tradition of the Grand Guignol, so a very bloody theater avant-garde in the early 20th century in Paris, and RuPaul Drag Race, with the artist Will Benedict and a big team of stylists, makeup artists, etc. And we are now creating the next Paris Plus conversation that will happen next week. Voilà.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's start. Daphne, you're the first provocation, so I will start your time now.
Hold on, wait. You cannot start it. I'm still figuring it out. I'm a grandmother.
I'll start when you start speaking. I give you that.
Okay, give me a second. Hop. Okay, having been a participant of several political processes over the past 20 years, and as a result, having engaged from colonial name change discussions of an art institution in Rotterdam to uncovering Nazi looting institutions in Amsterdam, to doing work in post-colonial Ottoman political geographies, but also work with a living uprising memorial in Korea. I'm really thankful to MMU for this invitation of self-reflection, for that hard to pin down, ever invasive curatorial DNA, that distilled templated essence, which is for me very much informed by the rivers of goddess of Mnemosyne, the memory. For the worlds, I'm trained as a political scientist. I've been in the field for 20 years as a curator. And with the world's volatile, asymmetric complexities eclipsing our capacity to dream and drift, trauma, individual and collective, is ever in motion. But unlike accomplished Buddhists, we don't always like to sit in the midst of the pain. We yearn for a break from our geotechnological present, a space to enact a kind of a politics that exceeds attention-grabbing rituals, a space in which we can invest our consciousness into our collective possibilities. What is an opening, I ask each time? Where is the energetic release of undoing? Where is the contact space between the distant past and its present resonances? The debater in me says, look outwards for the question, why, what if this and that? Then I look inwards for the answers of how to pluck out the roots of our shared comfortism.
In each context, I hone in with a journalistic, investigative, and ever-evolving instinct to sense into the ground and trace the geopolitical formations, reformations, and the waves. I'm steeped training, completely in political science. That is my comfort zone. But for the visual art performance world that I'm operating in, the main question remains how to rethink of art and its experiences and sometimes its institutions anew. With each undertaking, the curatorial strives to bring motion to stagnation or to locate a spark of enthusiasm in looking for that motion. For this, I care a lot about movement. I look at energy mobilizations or movement philosophies to access our cellular memory and ancestral epigenetics. With artists like Ada, I look into modalities of martial arts, violence sculpting, techniques of escalation and de-escalation. I care about how we move, how we can be moved, and how we move with and through other people in the constant movement of life, and how we can dive into the extra potential of every human. If the curatorial could activate the nodes in the networked intelligence, perhaps we could this way claim more of our quantum agency amidst our implicit entanglement with algorithmic regimes and rewire the pre-existing knowledges of our bodies. When both protest and critique reinforce the familiar, where taking a stand produces the very conditions that we seek to exile ourselves from, when responding to a crisis augments and sometimes becomes the new crisis, movement matters. In its basic currency and form, in waves, we have to learn to tune into the sonic frequencies of the forgotten system and sculpt and score some of our individual motivations, fears, desires into a collective. In the pursuit of community vis-a-vis the incursions of various violences, we need to continuously reinvent rituals of gathering and tease at established norms of socializing. In this shaky world of upheaval and automation, what is to be learned from self-organized systems? The meeting of humor, joy, and movement is a meeting of two freedoms, says Kira Nova, and looks into the ancient spontaneous trance-like dancing for resurrection technologies, for instance. All forms of togetherness, physical alliances of co-play or simulated alliances formed through role play have the cue within. Forms of friendship where loyalties can be formed with no obligation, through which anatomies and identities can shift and change. The desire for transformation, mutation, and invention continue. Keep testing them as to allow for new mergers of the organic and artificial, whether as a means of self-reinvention or as a foretaste of an inorganic future that can be experimented within. A yearning for the stance is paired, of course, with a non-stop schooling and adaptive resilience, especially in the face of sudden change, destruction, and violence. And a very sudden change is very much part of the artistic material of life, and a very real one in the face of state-induced violences. So back to the river of Memory Goddess, Mnemosyne, and Zone 1. Destruction, the very artistic material of 20th century in the unmaking, and its role to disrupt and confront the present cultural predicament is significant. To what extent can destruction and its processes of shattering, hijacking, and undoing be considered be transformative in order to engage in reinvention, asked artist Goshka Mazhuga in 2017 in her collaboration with Ahmet Öğüt. My interest in adaptive community building through movement and ongoing training and tactics of redirection is to co-evolve with patterns and habits of destruction, especially when it's not only a source of creative passion for artists for the last 100 years, but also for the algorithmic military complex as we keep experiencing it. Learning from artists who've engaged with the processes, with the gestures, who engage with these topics as subject, concept, processes, deducing metaphors and analogies from them that can be applied to any context seems important to me, especially for ways of exploring processes of peaceful resistance as well as reconstruction. Taking concepts from one realm and applying them to another, even if it means working from physical interactions in dance to relations in volatile Arendtian landscapes in everyday life, to the organization of curatorial research. Is it realpolitik or is it the imagination that really takes us to the real world? Sometimes I wonder. How to engage with brain label through simulations, games. Do you hear me?
We hear you. You have
Okay.
10 seconds left.
Done. All right. So what should I say? The mutualism, the epigenetics, and the risk. So for me, the curatorial motivations merge with the autobiographic, with the geopolitical monitoring. How to then dance together in a historically conscious mind and body expansion proposition in a multidimensional way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I didn't time it well enough, but here it is.
No, that was absolutely perfect. I will be brief with my in-between announcements, and we will directly move on to Pierre and Charles.
Hello. So yeah, let's start. So a few preliminary elements. Let's try first to define what is transgression. Extremely classical sense, transgression is the experience of a limit, the idea to recognize the law of the law, as it said in a famous prologue by Michel Foucault about Georges Bataille about the notion of transgression. For us, a museum ideally should accept a certain dose of ambiguity and foster readings that escape an exclusive lecture. Personally, we became interested by art because we were fascinated by the idea of extraterritoriality of museum and art as a place where you could find a tolerance toward representation, something that deals with a really classical notion of Aristotelian mimesis, a place where you could experience yourself to the shock, a moral injury, or a position of weakness. We think transversive space can bring a difference into play through language and formal games. Transgression is often a practice of ethic, who dissimulate itself behind a sort of folklore, the cult of the transgressor. Ultimately, transgression is still for us a resistance to conformism, even to the point of offense. What's the point to being offended? If there's like a place to being offended, it could take place in a theatrical space, a space like a museum, but not in the street or in a courtroom, where the rule of annexation, of course, different. For us, it is a bit the same when you accept to enter, for example, a cruising space or a sex club. It is a stage for performance in which, for example, the dumb top that insults you can be a gentle and civilized guy during the day. The museum could be a place for hostility, but a place of camp hostility, a distant and mediated place for sadomasochistic games between the audience and the artwork, between the institution and the public. We need to invent a culture of transgression that links different battles and culture of militantism, from feminism to decolonial, and that escapes the patronizing figure of the white heterosexual man as the only figure of transgressor. What we try to do is to recognize the legacy, but to escape the transgression à la papa. Often a really shallow lecture of icons like Marquis de Sade, Georges Bataille, Kateb Yassine, Jean Genet, Violette Leduc, to name a few, are often linked superficially, to alt-right icon. And for us, that's a big problem because that negates the revolutionary force that this kind of figure could foster. We need to understand that conservative forces are extremely far from the transgressive tradition, like Sade or Bataille. All these figures that we will quote have never been at the service of power and remain powerfully anti-establishment. They all share a ferociously anti-bourgeois, anti-appropriation, anti-capital, anti-family, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist reading of society. A museum is neither God nor the devil, and we need to distance ourselves from the concept of offense, a word that shares ambiguity, with the respect of a religious order. The only prerequisite, for inventing new and transgressive place or topos is to integrate the idea that the cult of transgression is a tradition, a genre per se. This is why we need to invent a camp or relecture of transgression. Transgression are often marked by a sense of buffoonery, and when they are taken too seriously, they become hilarious. we need to invent, in that sense, a transgression that really works more than it believes in their inherent transgressive value. With Charles today, we had invented 2 imaginary museums dedicated to sluttery and accidents. Welcome to the Museum as a Slut Machine. You're entering a zone of risk and turbulence, a zone of management of risk. So let me introduce my Museum of Slut, or my Museum as a Slut Machine. This museum was inspired by different notions that I borrowed from different authors. First, my point was to resexualize the public sphere, as it was often advocated by different intellectuals, mostly from the 70s. I was thinking now of Guy Hockenheim in France or Mario Melli in Italy. The museum should, for example, take inspiration from the gameplay theory of the Spanish author Itziar Ziga, who wrote that book in 2009, Becoming a Bitch. Like her, like us, we can sometimes disguise ourselves in a truck driver, sometimes as a bitch, with a feather boa. The museum should accept that the lecture between macho art and feminist art could become inoperable. We want a museum in this museum as a slut machine that assume an unapologetic desire. Again, inspired by Mario Melli, who was a transfigure militant, we call for a sexualization of the public sphere. In Mario Melli's essay, he imagined a museum that could be fuck in the arts, that accepts his most delicious bodily pleasure and anal intercourses. A museum that keeps his treasure in its house, but an area which is open to everyone. For us, we have imagined a museum, the black hole of a museum. Neither masculine or feminine, it produced a short circuit in sexual division. The black hole is a temple of pleasure, but also an abject place par excellence, due to its proximity to waste and shit. The museum should be a universal black hole through which gender, sexes, identities, and capital sleep. Melli called for a museum not focused on sexual identity, but on erotic abundance, a world in which artificial sexual scarcity will be unknown. The transgressive museum of the Nouveau Regime needs to rediscover its body and the fundamental metabolic and communicative function. A museum that could borrow its unapologetic desire to artist and writer Hervé Guibert, that imagined a post-mortem installation in his book, The Death Propaganda. I quote him, describing his installation: "My body, either under the effect of pleasure or pain, is put in a state of theatricality, of paroxysm, which I would like to reproduce in any way I can in photo, film, or soundtrack. As soon as a distortion occurs, as soon as my body becomes hysterical, I set in a motion of a transmission mechanism, belching, dejection, sperm after wanking, diarrhea, spitting, catarrh of the mouth and the ass. Let this convulse, chop it up, screaming body speak for itself. Place a microphone inside my mouth as it was full of dick, as deep as possible in my throat. In case of crisis, twitching, ejaculation, or brutal ejection of shit and rails. Place another microphone in my ass, whether it is bathed in my tide or hanging from the toilet bowl." A slut museum that postulates a radical hospitality and a new ethic of contact. That's my second point. This notion was inspired by cruising theorist and American author Tim Dean, who has replaced the work of Richard Serra, a famous one, and Kathleen Klein, in the Cloaca Maxima of Berlin, The Laboratory. In this recontextualization of Richard Serra's work, the blacksmith sculpture meet for the first time the clanking of chain and cage of this Rutiland BDSM complex. A slut museum that borrow also its slut technique to another artist, an irrécupérable, impossible to put in a museum. And my point is to quote the artist and prostitute Alberto Sorbelli, who was, he's in front of you, who was slightly excluded from the art world. In '94, he was part of a canonical exhibition called The Winter of Love, an exhibition of relational aesthetics that happened in France between the Musée d'Art Moderne and the Louvre. Sorbelli has presented himself as a transvestite prostitute in different museum contexts, Musée d'Art Moderne, Orsay, Le Louvre. From each of these outings, disguise was de rigueur. Latex miniskirt, fishnet stocking, stiletto heels, sometimes garter belt, and just the right amount of makeup, lipstick, earring, and hair held by granum. The artist describes the art world as a global world system. By playing the role of the art world, Sorbelli is simply exposing the underbelly of a system that will not dodge the blunt issue of the infrastructure, the designing machine that sustain it. So
without further ado, we're gonna enter the Museum of Accidents. At the dawn of the 2000s, Paul Virilio, French philosopher, imagined a museum of accidents. He defined it as follows: to exhibit the accidents, all accidents, from the most banal to the most tragic, from natural disaster to industrial and scientific catastrophes, but also the happy accident, from a stroke of luck to love at first sight. Exposing accidents so that we are no longer simply exposed to them. According to the Sigma report from one of the world's largest insurance companies, Swiss Re, at the dawn of the 2000s, damage caused by man-made accidents surpassed the one caused by natural disaster. Now we are adding to this tally the damage created by climate change, the scale of which is incommensurable. Paul Virilio's project was prefigured in the exhibition What Happens in English at the Fondation Cartier for Contemporary Art. But the museum itself mostly remained a dead letter. We propose to build it under the roof of a museum of transgression. The Museum of Accidents would have as a motto Hannah Arendt's quote, "Progress and catastrophe are the obverse and reverse side of the same coin." If every progress or invention is a symbolic monument devoted to the hegemonic order, every accident is its failure. Accidents are an attack against human techno-scientific ego and its will to control nature by regulating speed and the course of things. The paradox is that we are growing increasingly allergic to accidents. We are trying to avoid them by all means with insurance, security procedures, and algorithmic predictions. Even happy accidents, such as falling in love, are now the object of calculation. Yet, the number of sinister accidents has never been so outstanding. If museums have already seized on the idea of progress, we will take its negative, the accidents. We won't be talking about ships, planes, or artificial intelligence, but about wrecks, crashes, and bugs. Indeed, if invention is just a way of seeing, of grasping accidents as signs, as chances, then it's high time we open the museum to the unexpected, to the forbidden, denied, and therefore what modernity regards as transgressive, the accident. So that's a vision of the accident for traditional museum. So Museum of Accidents is not a theme park. Paradoxically, we are growing accident phobic. We have developed a proportional fascination for artificial accidents, or the accident thrill without its dire consequences. We psychologically train ourselves against accidents by making fun of them and reproducing them in vitro in theme parks. It won't be a museum of horror either. The Museum of Accidents will not be a cabinet of curiosity of human failures or a site to contemplate gruesome accidents. It will not delve into the gore or dark thirst for destruction. As such, it won't be a catacomb of the industrial age. We propose for the Museum of Accidents to invest all the sites of already happened catastrophes. So on the right, you have Bhopal, and then you have Gaetano Picche, current in architecture, and then you have Wall Street, New York Stock Exchange. The idea was inspired by Paul Preciado, who after the fire of Notre-Dame de Paris, thought that we should transform Notre-Dame de Paris into a queer, trans, and feminist center that should defend kids against pedocriminality, which is, as you know, not a little question for the church. The Museum of Accidents will do the autopsy of human direct and indirect accidents. It will be the anti-monument to all the industrial or technical museums by reinstating incertitude as the pivotal aspect of human condition. Its goal is double-folded: to avoid integral accidents, which is likely to internalize a multitude of incidents and disasters through chain reaction, and to reconcile humanity with machine contingencies. Admitting this is to transgress the current irrational belief in the possibility of annihilating unplanned events. Admitting this is the only way we can live with machines. The Museum of Accidents will be divided in 6 departments. First, the individual accident, represented by the rebellious sex robots imagined by Shulea Sheng in her lesbian cyberpunk porn I Kill You from 2000. Originally conceived as an android sex toys deployed to collect sexual data from men, these robots will free themselves from their mechanic sexual program and build a cyber lesbian utopia in the wild. Then we have like the infrastructural accident, which is inspired by the
Just a quick reminder to come to a close.
Okay.
This is amazing.
So in a few sec, we have infrastructural accidents, which is also about like finding cruising in an unexpected place, especially in architecture. Informational accidents, about economic crash. Industrial accidents, here represented by Lebbeus Wood. Natural accidents or climate change induced accidents. And then let's not forget godly accidents, inspired by the Epiphany of St. Paul, here reactualized by Pasolini in its unrealized script from the 70s. And then the scenography, because it's really important, obviously, will be done by Daniel Liebenskind and the Micromega, who is a satire of science inspired by Voltaire. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Incredible. With these wonderful provocations, that was absolutely fantastic. We now have our saboteurs. Please come in.
Oh, yes, it's not going to be easy. It's not easy at all. Because I didn't know, just like Winnie, we didn't know what you were going to say. We didn't enter your bureau d'esprit secretly and check out the visuals beforehand. So in a sense, this is a summary, but it's also a kind of a sabotage at the very possibility of what you're proposing. And what I find remarkable is in both cases, you have models for curatorial practice, ideas, notions of adaptive community building in the case of Daphne through movement, words that interest me like evasive curatorial DNA in the form of memory, evasive curatorial DNA. You speak, Daphne, of energetic release, how to rethink art experiences and institutions anew. And you speak a lot of agency, of bodies, of sonic frequencies, of rituals of gathering. And that's what you're looking at, how curatorial practice can tap into movement and rituals of gathering. And then we have probably the best titles ever for a museum of the future, the Museum of the Slut Machine, am I right? The Museum of Sluts and the Museum of the Slut Machine, where you stick a coin in. The museum fucked in the arse. I mean, what could be better than that? The idea that the treasure is in the arse is exactly how it is most of the time. And then you have, of course, the Museum of Wrecks and Crashes and Accidents. And actually, the museums are full of wrecks and crashes and accidents, only no one wants to admit it. And I think it's incredibly interesting that you develop the idea of transgression. So, but I want to come in and sabotage you by coming back to brutally pragmatic questions about curatorial practice. I think you've provided us with a stance in both cases with flesh. And I want to dissect the subject of this debating chamber and to find out what body of knowledge curatorial practice is attending to. And by that, I don't just mean the brilliance of your ideas, but really how we can understand curating and curatorial practice and its context today, and ideally make it jitter and vibrate and slide off the butcher's table so we can carve out our own critical imaginary. Now, my work as a curator is potentially very different to somebody else's, that's clear. But the issue is, how is this difference located? Is it intellectual, economic? Has it got to do with the relations that I set up to other people, in particular artists? Is it a practice of autonomy that frames our work as independent curators? Or is it one of risk and transgression? And is independence for a curator, is it desirable today? Can we promote it without initiating a professional bankruptcy and disassociation? By extension, is acceptable curatorial practice only that which an institution is ready to mediate? Here, the curator represents the institution, not some kind of autonomous idea or position or agency, and is contractually bound to follow its rules, both discursive, aesthetic, and societal. If a curator today and the artists they work with steer an alternative course to the normative mechanisms of the venue, say, divert the rules of a communications department or a team curatorial sector, they are held accountable and can lose the gig. Other curators cut their teeth on biennials, believing in the collectivity and generative growth of these temporary gatherings. But sometimes you can discern a kind of credit card curating that's going on, a fast purchase of diverse global art practice with little long-term engagement on the part of the curator, no glue to hold together new, very fragile relationships being forged between artists who meet for the first time at biennials. Here you could ask, does a curator hold a responsibility to artists to make sure they're not treated like one-hit wonders, disposable and replaceable cabaretists in the theatre of exhibition making? Other curators work for private foundations and dealer galleries, benefiting from the market structure and its high-octane finance. Wow, the scale of a private production is well worth the engagement of an artist. Why refuse to collaborate with capital investors if it can give you and your work massive calibration and visibility? And those curators who have the in to such foundations, who select artists on the grand luxury magnitude that we know today, they know that ultimately money is at the whim of the private individual, and therein lies their risk. But other curators don't want that. They prefer public venues, seeing themselves as cultural workers, feeling conscientiously that art is always democratic, intended for a wide audience, and therefore has to be public-facing, never private, not held behind closed door in the asshole of communication, not initiate. Otherwise, it falls into the murky Kabbalistic cellar of proto-fascist expression. And there, I think Bataille really signifies with his Collège de Sociologie exactly that type of Kabbalistic cellar. So I can't help thinking that transgression is a modernist violence, an avant-garde concept that you mentioned, Pierre-Alexandre, that smacks of outdated understandings of the underground, mediated by deceased artists whose body of work remains incredibly seductive. And let's face it, to curate a dead or an alive artist is a very different process. Today's high visibility precision reconnaissance implies that both the artist and the curator need to be very aware of whom they are addressing. No longer, my exhibition, my museum is for the whole world, but who can I trust to show my work to? Who provides that safe space? Which form of art venue? Which curator? And then there is a discipline that subtends a curatorial practice. Did you study art history, anthropology, design, architecture? Because this gives you legitimacy. But how about if we recognize these disciplines in terms of the colonialism and the extraction that generated them? If we are working towards a decolonial curatorial model, which is necessary, it's an imperative, then what are we doing about context? Context is not a given, but it's inherently tied to the discourse of one discipline. And what do you do about contentious material, even if we like it, because of its perverse nature, its challenge? Do curators actually help to diffuse stereotypes? And can it be done, and this is important, without falling prey to the master explanatory language transmitted by wall posters, labels, apps, or QR codes, but instead through the direct reception of the work and the efforts of artists to forge new visions, new metaphors, and basta? Surely as curators, we need to trust the power of the artwork to address an audience without all the didactic prostheses currently deployed in exhibitions, as if the artwork alone was inherently insufficient and the public unable to grasp the little it provides. And
I have to give a time cue. Very sorry.
Yeah, I'm nearly done. And so it becomes easier for curators to search for themes, to exhibitions that, rather like a menu in a restaurant, correspond to a current flavor for which artworks can illustrate the subject at hand, be it climate, oceans, identity politics, gender, etc. Why has curatorial education, since it emerged in academia in 1990, focused primarily on how to make an exhibition? And if not, wherein lies the curatorial nerve? To have nerve, to risk one's career, to throw one's skin in the game. Is this something problematic, fussy, frowned upon today? If artists are ready to search for that nerve in their own work, if they are, then why are curators acting like service departments in a large hotel? And what can we do against standards and norms of scheduling 3 months and another show and another show and another budget, all utterly unsustainable? I ask you, is it more valuable to spend 50,000 euros on scenography or 50,000 euros on artist productions and curatorial research? What are we frightened of? What is failure for a curator? In the future, what roof will shelter us from the populist command of the curatorial industry? So I would like to say that with a sense of unforeseeable energetic release and spirituals of gathering, let's let the horse out of the gate. Thank you.
I wish after all of these we could have like an applause we can hear. So weird over Zoom. But anyways, please, Winnie.
Thank you very much for everyone's very inspirational speech. I guess, in comparison to all the saboteurs and provocateurs here, I'm probably the least experienced, of you all. But, just to address a few points of, what everyone had said before, I find definitely Pierre-Alexandre and Charles, you guys' idea are really interesting. But I guess, I come into this debate in a very much more pragmatic vein. And, throughout those, theses of those imaginary museums, like the question that jumps out to me the most is, firstly, who is your target audience? And secondly, how do you mitigate, say, for instance, safety hazard or, things that would potentially, be needed, like a sort of parental guidance, etc. And lastly, how do you intend to, measure the impact of, how well your audience has connected with each other, say, with definitely what you've proposed with, this ritual of gathering and with this, reconnection to, this primordial sense of ourselves through the body. But yeah, these questions I wish to leave open. And then moving on, as Clémentine Sabotage has just kind of defined this idea of, risk within the curatorial space, I guess the key question she posed was, where lies the curatorial nerves and who is risking, their position as curators. I'm here talking in response as someone who's chosen a much more risk-averse path. And this is a bit of context. So I'm, a 23-year-old who has considered, the career as an independent curator and unfortunately gave up during my time as an undergraduate. Just a disclaimer. I also come into this debate in quite a particular perspective, since I studied at quite a elitist place, and our history in the UK was also perceived as quite a privileged subject to study. And I wanted to remain in the UK partially because in China there weren't like as many sort of good options for alternative courses, and obviously with the censorship etc. going on, I felt it is much more favorable environment in the UK to make exhibitions and so I guess the questions I want to pose to the provocateurs as well as to the audience is, who can afford to take risks? And I think to be able to take risks, this is actually a luxury rather than a necessity. And I want to talk about the covert risk of becoming a curator. And there are 3 key points I want to address. The first one, which is probably the most relevant to myself, would be the right to remain to work in certain countries. The second risk would be the financial risk enticed in funding an exhibition, so to speak. And the last point of risk I want to think about is the infrastructure, especially when you're working independently outside of an institution. So to illustrate my first point of view, I want to tell you an anecdote. When I was talking to the career service of my university, which I was lucky that, we had a functioning career service, and they just told me to find another career path, because it was frankly unsustainable as, an immigrant in the UK to try to even consider, a career as a curator. And, there are multiple sort of rules in place. Say, for instance, when you apply for a visa, especially in comparison to artists, I think, the results you achieve as a curator is a lot less, measurable by the piece of work, so to speak. So I think to summarize my first point, I think to be able to make it, requires, immense talent and luck, especially when, you're an immigrant, or, when you're somehow accidentally holding the wrong passport, so to speak. My second point will be financial risk, and how are you going to sustain yourself in the background whilst your curatorial, venture is happening. The anecdote would be when I was speaking to, when I was having a conversation with a mid-career art history professor at my previous university, who also curates on the side, and she said her sister works in finance, so she could afford to be more chill. And I guess her definition of more chill was to take on the endeavor of art history and curating. I guess, the key question I want to pose is, to all of you who are more experienced, is that how much are you getting paid per exhibition, if any? Because the stats I have from the UK is that, it is in fact, you're quite limited in resources. And especially if you decide to go DIY, right? Say, for instance, not within, an institutional or commercial context, you're probably covering the fees like for the artists, like out of your own pocket, as well as probably like Frankensteining all the equipment in place if you're, say, for instance, exhibiting videos, whatnot. And then partially probably also drawing some fundings by fundraising through your friends and family. So I guess, this in summary also causes a lot more risk in terms of how to cover your back with the financing. And thank you, Joanna, I see you're appearing. And lastly, just to quickly mention my point in infrastructure, I think a few things to consider when it comes to curating outside the context of an institution is, firstly, you're lacking of those procedures and those protection mechanisms. Say, for instance, when you have a communication breakdown, how are you going to deal with it? And secondly, although you have you might have a great network of people and strings to pull, you still bear this risk because you never quite know how your working style can align with someone else. And you're potentially risking your inner peace when, say, for instance, you're dealing with a demanding collaborator who is kind of also a friend, whatnot. This kind of thing happens a lot in the art world, I suppose. So to summarize, I guess, I'm just, pointing a few ways which, I think the ideological curatorial debates are very interesting, but a few sort of, much more practical pillars that is supporting, to support the curatorial ventures. And so to speak, hence I want to just, reemphasize my point that I think being able to take risk is, a luxury. And for myself, I've unfortunately chosen a path where I go study somewhere, where, the food costs like 20p every time I try to have lunch, and hoping that at some point my kids can, embark on this amazing career as a curator. And thank you very much. This is my Sabotage.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I feel like we do have a lot of clashes going on already and things that intertwine with each other. And then I want to give our provocators a chance to briefly respond to the sabotages. Daphne, maybe you want to start?
Hi, my mood board was more in the esoteric resurrection chamber zone. So more in the frequencies and vibrations. So working all around the world on the search for lived justice, and how can exhibitions or biennials or microscopic research platforms can actually be these delivery platforms. So for me, it's somewhere a space between theater world and a journalism world. In that two pillars of truth, mechanism, distribution, testing how truth is delivery can be delivered worlds, creating a space for art where these two industries can collapse and exist within an art world that is mostly shaped by art history, which I have not studied. And I am interested in movement simply because of a lot of the potentials that can be explored, choirs, ensembles, sports games, clubbing, all of that stuff. But what you ask is like, how does it really materialize in an exhibition context? I've been testing various versions, but because I mentioned the sudden change and political volatility is such a reality of our world, it also interrupts. So I might be wanting to give a funeral to a giant biennial in Korea, but then with pandemic hitting, funeral takes a whole another meaning, and the whole scored procession might be feeding a television studio-like environment. Or I might be co-imagining with my Sputniks and fellow thinkers of an institution that is constantly in motion and collaborative scoring possibility with its audiences, and then war happens, the institution is hit by a meteorite, basically, which was already in the making and coming, but the war comes and interrupts, so the institution doesn't get to be realized. So I am constantly dealing, because of my autobiographic, karmic, whatever it is, I attract a lot of volatility and magnetize a lot of situations that I have to constantly develop techniques to work with. That is intellectual, philosophical, artistic. I have amazing constellation of artists that I've worked with over the last 20 years, on and off. I take the criticism of Clémentine. It's not always sustainable that you work always with the same artist, but there are curators who do that, which I admire. They have an ongoing relationship for a lifetime with 5 artists, and it works marvelously for them. So we need, the choice is yours. When I went to HR in university, they told me I'm going to be an arts manager. I didn't know what the fuck that meant. I was going into the World Bank. That was my trajectory. Like, I was going to do a work with social justice, woman movement, somewhere in that space. So I'm like, what is an arts manager? So I found myself first in advertising, and then I found my way out into a world that has become, so the curatorial exercise that I've done in Amsterdam, a 7-month crash course, again brought me a historical story that was so prone for exploitation for all parties. So I navigated it with an invitation to an artist. So for me, it's everybody develops their own path. Clémentine might have a completely different experience, and so does Charles and Pierre Alexander. So, and in terms of the fees and all of the technical details you ask, every case is different. Sometimes you get $1,000, sometimes you get $20,000, sometimes you get $5,000, sometimes you get $30,000, but they give you an amazing, travel budget. You say, okay, I'll do it. So every year it's a bit different, but there is also norms. Like now there is like wage and initiatives that standardize a human basic level for art workers, what should be paid and what should be, but still it's not always honored. I actually don't know how much I'm going to get from this session because we worked so hard on that toolbox. It cost me probably 3 full days, not like just this 2 hour of presentation. But I am very happy. Anybody who's curious about professional experiences in Korea, in China, in Italy, in Moscow, in Rotterdam, in Amsterdam, in New York, in Turkey, where I'm from, like, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll take you through the Byzantine labyrinths of each context.
I was wondering, could I ask something actually just in response to Daphne, your response? What do you feel like was a trade-off when you've decided, you said embarked on a career in advertising. What was a trade-off when you've then decided to, start, your own curatorial project? And in which case do you find embarking, on, this career trajectory as a curator in some way, implicate a lot more risk than what you were doing previously? And if so, how were you sort of how are you sort of making sure that you kind of have a basic level of coverage when you do decide to put yourself in a riskier position?
I think it's your spirit. You need to constantly take leaps. Like advertising was actually a talent management agency, met incubation, technology, venture, 20th century, all this like Silicon Valley lingo, which collapsed. It was a beautiful collapsing project for 2 years where we tested the parameters, what that experimental space could be like in the middle of New York as a startup. And I loved every aspect of the fact that we kept taking risks in every direction. Was it sustainable financially? It didn't hit the millions as the founders imagined it, but it gave me such a training through different departments, whether it's production or venture capital or advertising or community. So it gave me a very broad training, and I wish the art world actually tooled its curators with much more than the dry scholarly knowledge, because there's so much to be taken in from other fields that we can bring to our work. I mean, it could be music, it could be your cruising histories, could be a lot of autobiographical experiences as well. So Winnie, whatever you're articulating in terms of your personal experience as an immigrant, I presume in England, like you need to really sculpt it into your own demands and experiences, into your journey constantly. Like it is what's going to make you flow. Like for me, it was,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Please do finish your sentence in a second. I just really think that we would love to open up the debate soon. So I would love for Charles and Pierre to respond to the sabotage quickly, and then we can go into public discussion.
Yes. On a really pragmatic level, our practice is really do-it-yourself most of the time. We collaborate with institutions, but that's something like pretty recent. I will say, if you have like a risky project, a museum or an institution is probably not the right place. It's unfortunate that because of scale, the virality of communication, the number of persons you will employ in matter of responsibility, a project too risky, for example, bringing to the fore the kind of irrecoverable figure I try to mention, like Alberto Sorbelli, an artist and a prostitute, or I wanted to quote also Colette Peño, a poet and a second wife of Georges Bataille. I think the kind of purpose they have, the kind of ethos they have is so risky and so transgressive that it will be difficult right now to contextualize them in an institution. I don't think it's impossible, but let's say there are different contexts where it will be way more easier, like a non-profit. There are like intermediary place when you could still exhibit or having this kind of material. But again, I think the scale of infrastructure that represent a museum is so big, such a leviathan now, that it becomes difficult to address a really transgressive subject. The second point, maybe more pragmatically, about like the finance. And I would say there are two parallel markets. You can do your risky project on the side and you still can have a kind of benefit that you will convert after in an institution, because institutions are still sensitive by risk took by independent curator. So I would say you should manage to have both career, one foot in an institution, another in a non-profit, and you could manage making your own market and trying to convert the one with another. That's a little bit what we are doing with Charles, making our independent project and other more
institutional.
More institutional. Yeah, sorry.
And what I may add is, obviously, I think one of the solutions, at least for us, was we have been like incredibly pushy with like every institution, every person we met. We proposed like 1,000 of projects. We have like a folder in our computer with like, I don't know how many unrealized projects. And I was listening to an artist, I don't remember her name, but it was at Art Basel, the Premier Artist Talk this year. And she had this advice for young artists, but I think it applies as well to young curators. And her advice was like, be ready, be always ready, be always thinking about the project. Don't wait someone, just like invent project. Like, it could be one artwork in a specific place, like, Richard Serra and catching a leaf in the laboratory in Berlin. It's like a genius idea. In terms of production, it's like not much. I mean, you have to contact Richard Serra estate, and that's another thing. But, you can have like a one-liner exhibition that can have like a massive, visibility and make, give you some traction, some symbolic power to then convert that into a museum. And so like, it's always this idea that if you're not always, especially as an independent curator, if you're not always thinking about project, and it could be, of course, a book, a public program, a performance, an exhibition, and that you have to propose many projects. At some point, a project can be refused many times, and 10 years later, it becomes a biennial or whatever. I think that's one of the core principles we apply to ourselves. And now we have like tons of garbage projects. I don't know. That are ready to be realized. And at some point, we also wanted, like part of the presentation to say, maybe we could speak of a few of them. And in fact, it's a bit too egotistic and not really interesting. But it's also, never lose an opportunity to sell your projects and just send them, just like harass people with them.
One of our first projects was a museum as a suicide machine. That's a project that 10 years ago. It's a kind of impossible project to sell or to negotiate with an institution. Maybe it was also not enough mature in the argument, but that's an example of project So that never happened, and that's almost 10 years. We collect information about suicide, different books, different machinery in literature. The museum as a Thanato museum, as a lethal machine, from sarcophagus to Kafka. A penitentiary machine. There are a lot to say, for example, about like museum as a suicide machine, but a little bit too risky maybe to present right now.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we're actually right on time to open up the debate. I want to thank all the speakers for the presentations and the talks right now. And now I want to ask everyone to be so kind and turn on their camera so we can talk to each other. That would be amazing. We're now in the public debate, and if you have any questions, if you have comments, if you want to say something, please do raise your hand. I will have an eye on that and bring you in. And I think the one thing that that I kind of have in mind right now after this, amongst other things, is how you all also kind of touched upon the agency of bodies within this. I remember that definitely you talked about hijacking and undoing, and I feel like that's something that for me all connects to exploitation, which has also been brought up. And I'm very interested in this point of the relationship between the curator and the artist. And if like with this risk of exploitation happening, how to navigate that and if you have any experiences and thoughts on this. And this is just for me one comment to bring in. If you want to touch up on it, please do take it. I, as a first stool pigeon, I would really like to bring in to react on this. We have Luke Willis-Thompson in the audience, and I'm very sure that you have some thoughts on these things. And so if you would like to, I would like to invite you to, react.
Thank you. It's really lovely to see so many friends. I saw Augustine before, of course, Clémentine, Joanna, Jacob, Toby. What a joy. It's really early here. I got up at 5 a.m. I'm in Tamaki Makaurau, just Auckland, New Zealand right now. I don't know. I guess this is a bit wild. I'm just going to go there because it's the first thing that comes to mind, and it's your fault for asking me to speak first. From the audience, lived justice. That's a nice term. Thank you, Daphne. And what roof will shelter the curatorial populism? Will shelter us from curatorial populism? Being here and working in Aotearoa and leaving Europe has meant, I think, less about the museum. We don't really have a museum. We have a couple of totally sclerotic museums doing very disinteresting things, often receiving the satellite shows from Tate. And we have a couple of very interesting Kunsthalers, one ran by Ruth Buchanan, that is, I suppose, opening the most space for interesting work. And we have maybe two interesting dealer galleries and a handful of uninteresting ones. So there isn't much here, really, to see, and because there's not much here to see, you understand that abolishing the exhibition is just fine, right? If we abolish exhibitions, life is still good. It really still is good. There's still all sorts of interesting thinking. It's really in conversation that things get good. It's where you find the art here. But I'm not advocating for that, right? And Skin in the Game as a show, I think, is a good counter argument. And because we don't have that much here, well, quite frankly, you would want more. One wants more for sure. But what it really says when you say we don't need it, we want it, but we don't need it, is it kind of how do I put it? Yeah, maybe I just lost my train. That's the 5 a.m. thing. Not having these sites isn't a big deal, but of course they're great. But just having that position, right? It means like I'm less afraid to do the work required to produce the institutions we want. Because if you know what not having it there and you understand how that is just as interesting, then you are much less likely to accept the bullshit version of a museum or the bullshit version of an institution. And I just wanted to give one example of thinking metabolically, but I'm going to pivot away from the museum to the university, because I teach a course on Indigenous theoretics. It's a paper that I wrote. It's a second-year paper. And I love it. I love teaching. And it's in a bullshit neoliberal university and art school. And I just want to say something about that. But Joanna, you have to kill the next part of what I say from the recording, or I will most definitely get fired if anyone sees it. And this is the second half of what I want to say. I just want to urge what I thinking metabolically could be, and it might help this discussion in some small oblique way. So here I go. Ko te aroha ano he wai, I pupu ake ana, he awa I mapuna mai ana, I roto I tu whātu manawa. Ko tōna mata puna he hunu, ka ia ka rere ano. Ko tōna mata puna he hunu, ka ia ka rere ano. He tai to me, he tai pare, he tai opae, he tai roa, he tai nue, he tai nue. That Waita, that song, is really for the speakers, to support you, to thank you.
If I may, I'd like to just jump in here and ask Warren Nijvig what he thinks about all this. Because we're in the launch of the Metabolic Museum-University and it's an online project, but B, because you, Luke, have brought up this question of sabotage within the university institution, and I guess in the art school too, because it's an arts university. How would you see this, Warren? How do you consider curatorial risk?
Audio. Can you hear me now? Well, thank you. Yeah, I've been listening attentively and intensely. My position, I have a slightly different position. I feel that there has been a lack of emphasis in recent years in universities to theory and philosophy and epistemology in a certain way. And I understand the problem, as I see it, is a historical one, where the whole idea of, and it kind of started with the idea of conceptual art as a kind of transformation or translation of theory into aesthetic production, which is always the wrong way to go. And my point is that art creates theory, that very differently than Joseph Kosuth would say, which is, art after philosophy. In fact, it's the exact opposite, that art estranges, it rebukes, it tears down, it confronts, it does all these things that require, whether it's philosophers or sociologists or whoever, post-colonialist theorists, to create new kinds of languages and new kinds of words and philosophies to be able to put the world back into some sort of sense. So I look at it very much in that context. It seems to me that all of what everyone's been talking about today, I came in a little late because I had an emergency that I could not avert, but I made it. And the thing what I've heard in the last 45 minutes is that, I think that's where we are today. The system has failed, and artists of different ilk, with using different methodologies, different apparatuses, coming from different backgrounds and cultural foundations, are, in their own way, whether it's the Slut Museum, for instance, making things strange, making things, very slippery, making things wet, very emotional, whatever. And in that way, those forms of transgressions are creating, new epistemologies, and I'm very excited by that. That's all I can say.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Oh, I think Felipe, yeah, you go.
There was at some point in, I believe, Charles and Pierre's presentation, I think you brought up the concept of camp transgression, which I thought was really interesting. And I don't think you really fully defined it, so I'm not really trying to interpret what it is that you meant by the term, but the term itself made me think about the definition of camp and how in one of the ways in which it circulates in the art world or in cultural theory is that it was already supposed to be transgressive in and of itself, the very notion of camp. And then that we have to then use camp as kind of like a way to make transgression transgressive. To me, it points to how transgression and risk can really be seen as genres within the art world and the myth of autonomy. Because without the myth of autonomy, perhaps I should posit this as a question. Could we have a notion of risk without believing in the myth of autonomy? And I say that because the very definition of the avant-garde, or the predominant definition of the European avant-garde, is grounded on the notion of transgression, right? And from then on, it became used and recycled and regurgitated as this sort of assumed common goal, an undefined assumed common goal, as if we all had a similar enemy, as if we all had similar concerns or similar needs. And which makes perfect sense with the myth of autonomy, which comes with the category of art and many of the categories we're using today from colonial European humanist values, right? And so I often find that by being constrained to that kind of conceptual framework, it's very hard to actually pierce through a sort of kind of like symbolic or metaphorical sense of the transgressive, because I think we end up kind of being stuck in this almost like theatrical transgression as like genre, or like transgression as content, right? It's great content for museum exhibitions. It's great content for artistic productions. But it often isn't really grounded and defined. And I think the reason why that is because in order to do that, you need to attack the myth of autonomy, and you need to talk about money, and you need to start unveiling or undoing the sort of kind of like this godlike value that all of these terms have acquired in the industries that we kind of circulate in, and so I really appreciate both Winnie's contribution with her simple question of how much money do you make, and also I really appreciate Luke's contribution that despite the fact that I couldn't understand what it was that you were singing, I think that the gesture the gesture alone to me does more than perhaps the meaning, and not because the meaning doesn't matter, but I think I think also meaning can also become trapped in kind of this theater of representation that we're kind of perhaps trying to pierce through. But yeah, I really appreciate it.
I would like to ask Toby first because you raised your hand, and then I see that Charles and Pierre really want to respond as well. So please.
If Charles and Pierre want to respond, let them jump in. Like, I think they're far more important to hear from than me.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, what we added this layer of camp transgression, it's because, of course, there is such a cult of the transgressor. We arrived so late. We arrived with already that in our luggage, in our methodology. We grew up with the idea, the idealized vision of the transgressor, and it's almost a guilty pleasure. It's now a sort of folklore that still have like a revolutionary virtue, I think. But we can treat this material as we were like in the 70s or post-war, and we're like still amazed by Vito Acconci, I don't know, gesture. I mean, of course, we necessitate a bit of distance and a bit of campy lecture of that. You talked a lot about like autonomy of art. I found that really interesting. For example, you can have like a campy lecture of what could be a slut museum, just talking about like the aura or the finance power of a piece, of a painting. If like a painting cost, I don't know, 5 million at Christie's, it probably has like a slut value in my sense. So you can operate, for example, like a slut campy relecture of an extremely expensive artwork will become like this kind of totema of a rich person, a little bit like the Mark Roscoe Seagram painting at the Four Seasons that he made for the annoying rich person who will eat at the Four Seasons. So some painting, some artwork, because of their aura or finance aura, could be in itself inherently transgressive and slut. So I would say a museum could play with a campy relecture of that and playing with like a slutty relecture of this kind of artwork. Yeah. Sorry.
If I just jump in with a couple of comments, and feel free to cut me off and say I'm chatting crap. Firstly, like the thinking this debating chamber sparked in me has been great. Like Clémentine, thinking about what you mentioned earlier about the transgression as a modernist violence, and then for me that connects to something Felipe was talking about as this notion of autonomy. And throughout I was thinking, almost from the start, and Daphne, you spoke about rivers and thinking about curatorial positions. And I just thought, actually, to sort of riff off Luke's thinking, do we need to abolish the art world? Like, is it useful having this arbitrary thing we call the world, when actually we just need to remember, to quote Luke, the unseen worlds we feel on our skin, and actually remember we're all in this together. We can step into a river and we'll never step into the same river twice, to use another or famous quote. So for me, like, actually, is risk and transgression even a thing, when actually what we should be doing is thinking about the no things that are actually around us, and then thinking about actually how can we invent philosophical languages to build new earths together. And that's me saying a lot of big words, so I'm going to shut up.
Isn't it transgressive to be against transgression?
Yeah.
So we see this is why we need to invent new languages.
I feel like since you touched upon what on Daphne's provocation, Daphne, do you feel like responding to what Toby just brought in?
Joanna, first of all, I want to respond to you because I heard what you said in terms of the exploitation of the bodies. And there's many schools and many approaches and many wonderful positions also artists bring. But there's also a lot of 50 shades of complicity that institutions bring. Institutions by their creations are complicit in the nexus of power dynamics, and there are some positions who rather stay outside, who say they don't want to be processed, they don't want to be, for their radical positions in queer or activist or feminist or anti-racist movements, they don't want to be processed by the belly of the beast, and they want to punch differently, and they want to enable change differently. So there is a variety of ways of moving and movement, and how to actually score those individual fears and communal fears and desires. Like, that's really the essence. On the other side, I was really thinking of the European avant-garde, which was mentioned. I mean, the whole futurism movement, like, was born in this post-Ottoman geography, and it was all the war sounds that really triggered, the idea we need to kill the museums and get rid of this and that. Like, this whole destructive energy actually started in the border of Greece and Turkey and Syria, all this like lust manifestos that were published, in Figaro in France, like they actually came from the region. So I'm thinking a lot how we're back in a different way to the region and to the importance of the region in the reevaluation of the power matrices as they've been, done to our world for hundreds of years. In that sense, I'm also thinking New Zealand and Fiji. I've had experiences with schools myself. I've seen their corporatization. I've seen how institutions can sanitize. So being in and out, I think is a healthy way of existing in the art world, because none of us are independent. I love the word interdependent, and I'm sure everybody has something to say about that word, but we are interdependent. There is no independence. I try even to minimize like contractual obligations. Like this year, I signed no contracts. I'm just working out of my freedom space, trust space, and try to make that work, because it also became so bureaucratic and so ridiculously entangled. I shake hands and I trust. Let's see how that goes. It's an experiment of freedom this year. I have never done it for 20 years. And roof has blown off a while ago. This is not a recent blow off. And how we deal with sudden change, with forces of destruction, cognitive or algorithmic or military, or like that's where we need to really draw in how we sculpt violence instead of resisting, how we sculpt it and move with it. And therefore I highlighted the movement techniques. We need to rewire our bodies in a different way if we want to reinvent also machineries like museums or curatorial gymnastic halls and all that.
I would be very interested if somebody else in the debating chamber would like to speak. I don't know you all. I can recognize David Lau is here, and I'm just wondering if in the last few minutes there is somebody who has been listening and would like to say something. And if not, maybe I could just add something about trust. Very often I wonder, who are the curators that I can trust? Who do I trust to talk about ideas? Who's interested in listening to the ideas that I might have as a curator? And I think that's the problem for me, that the reason that the question of, okay, which institution do you want to work with? If you take a suitcase of great ideas like Pierre-Alexandre is suggesting, small, sharp, clean and precise ideas, and you pitch them, do you orient that in any way, or do you just assume that you will either get the gig or not? I don't know at this moment in time, the moment in time in which we are speaking, who the trusted interlocutors on the curatorial scene are. If we have invited you, Daphne, you, Pierre-Alexandre, and you, Charles, it's because of your independence. I wouldn't say your autonomy, but the fact that you aren't working at the moment directly under the roof of an institution. And I think that this should be recognized as actually quite a hard position to take. And I do believe that curatorial education has not done us a favor over the last 30 years. It's created clones, curatorial clones more than anything. And for me, curating is definitely not reduced to exhibition making. And I always get very sad when I see that this is actually what is being taught, that to curate, you make exhibitions. You don't even need to talk to artists. Ideally, you make exhibitions with dead artists. Then you just work with the lenders and the experts. And you have nobody coming back and saying, God Almighty, what are you doing with this work of mine? I'm not taking part in your show. So I think there's an opportunism there that I wanted to address briefly, the opportunism of being able to just produce a lot of ideas, which then get, you take the opportunity, you run with it, you do it, doesn't matter who. And there's another kind of question about the ethics of the projects that we do. And I know that I am responsible to the artists I work with, and I prefer that engagement with the artists than I do to the assumption that I'm responsible to an audience. And I firmly believe that there's curatorial practice that needs to take place behind the scenes that isn't public facing. I am tired of public facing compromises that are part of curatorial practice. And certainly what I tried to do at KW was to suggest that an institution that has an experimental remit, that is an institute of contemporary art, has an obligation to enable conversations to take place outside of the public realm. And it's very hard. You don't get funding for it. It's not even really recognized. And so I think that these questions that you brought up today, if Winnie brought them back to the ground and asked, pragmatic questions about how she as a 23-year-old can ever begin to survive as a curator, I don't think we should give us older characters any kind of false illusions or give, that it's easier now. It's exactly as hard as it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago. It's probably even harder. So I just wanted to add that about this whole kind of subject matter that we proposed for the first debating chamber, which is this question of both what is risk, what is transgression, and how does it enter into curatorial practice. But maybe there are other people who would like to engage in the last few minutes of the debate. I'm dying to hear what David Lau thinks, lawyer, very quiet. Okay. Sitting in Berkeley. Any thoughts on the part of the faculty? Ollie, Eddie, Christina, Jacob.
I just want to say I'm very thankful. I think the whole talk and all your thoughts and were extremely generous, and it makes me very optimistic, what we are also dealing with this MMU, to keep believing, to have trust, to exploit the system, and keep working. And I really like the idea of not to wait for the rich prince on the horse. We have to keep working and make the best out of it. So thank you for that.
Cool.
But someone wants to say something.
Yes, Dragos. We can't.
You're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Dragos Ola, and I'm working as an artist in an art collective called Apparatus 22, but also as a clumsy curator in a duo called Kilobase Bucharest. And I have just two sort of questions. It's for you, Clémentine, also, but also for Daphne and also Charles and Pierre Alexander. One of the questions is, what is the role of artists in your curatorial practice? I'm curious because, of course, the presentations were very much like curatorial manifestos, and very concentrated and dense, but then also I was curious exactly, and also both of the presentations were very much around concepts that are driven by you. So I'm curious exactly, where the artists are coming into these proposals, into these approaches. This is one, and then second, I don't know how it is for you, but for me, growing older, I think I just realized it's more and more for this necessity of being transgressive and not caring anymore about the rules. I was expecting that growing older it would make me softer, but I think it works the other way. I think this idea of not having the time and like sometimes thinking more and more about the agency as an artist or agency as a curator when you do things, it really and also in a way seeing around there's a sort of a lack of courage. I think it's a lot. We're discussing a lot with different institutions. We work in different contexts, and we saw that courage is in a short supply. People think too much about what the boss is saying, what the politicians are saying, what the board is saying. And I think, I don't know, I think people should have much more courage. And this is also something that, in a way, in what we do, it's pushing us to be more and more sharp and irreverent with the rules and how things are done, let's say, in a proper way, in an academic way, in what curating is or what, certain ways of acting as an artist should be. So I'm curious also in your cases, Daphne, and all of you, in fact, how it's your relationship with this idea of subversiveness is changed in time.
Pierre, do you want to go first? Charles? No.
You want to go, or should we go, or how do we do?
Yeah, go for it, Pierre. Yeah.
Of course, most of the time it's the artist itself who takes the major risk. As a curator, we are more like the umbrella. The intermediary figure will renegotiate maybe with a different public figure and figure of public society, how to make maybe the work more less risky. I don't think it's a bad stuff as a curator to renegotiate a project, to refine it and to make it more digestible for an institution. I think that's an effort which is fertile for everyone at the end. But to go back to the position of artist, of course, the artist is still central, the pivotal figure of everything. Even in our manifesto, we quoted different artists, different slut artists, for example, Alberto Sorbelli, Colette Peño, yes, the curator as an umbrella, but the artist at the core of the risky position.
Yes, but then I think one of the most productive collaboration between, at least what we did and an artist is like to offer the person like a new ground to experiment, or like a new type of a spectacle or project to do. For example, like the musical we did with Will Benedict, it was the first time he did a musical, and it was our first time as well. And I think that's interesting when you can give an opportunity to someone and a budget to do something that is like, that he was thinking about, of course, but that's like go out of his orbit of creation radically. And just one thing, because you mentioned subversion, and I think one of the most precious advice we and I just remember it now, the most precious advice we had from another creator was to when you have a project which is too subversive for an institution, you just have to coat it into something less subversive. And I think subversion can also hide itself within an exhibition. It can become this kind of Easter egg. You just have to take a step back and just like follow the subversion in different ways, like formulate the exhibition or an artwork in other ways in order for the institution to accept it. But then people will be able to work the institution and the project and see maybe in certain part of the exhibition, certain subversion that was missed by the museum itself.
Joanna, we are running out of time, I see. So maybe Daphne, do you want to come in briefly and then I'll respond and make a lot of noise about the next debating chamber?
Yeah. I mean, artists for me we are co-thinking together, we're co-evolving together, we're co-creating together. And absolutely, I mean, the word collaborator has been hijacked by the early 20th century, but it is essentially the spirit is move the conversation together, like in the spaces where we want to take them. So in every case, it's a bit different, but definitely co-evolving together as a community. The conversation is key to our medieval art world, even if we want to shatter it and break it open and reinvent it and all that. Like without conversation, nothing moves. And Vinny, with your funding question, how do I fundraise? I wanted to say the best crash course I had in curatorial program, which was 6 months, and it was already too much for me. You know, a fundraiser came and said, I have nothing to teach, go and research. And then everybody was paying her to teach this. But that's what we learned. Like you kind of have to sneak around and figure it out through your professors or your mentors and this and that, and figure out your own world within it.
Okay, so Dragos, I think your question is very important. And I kind of believe that each curator, like each artist, has their own stance. Or I believe in the stance not as a label or as a discursive issue, but as a desire. And I think you find that with artists and where they go. Take Joël Tuurlinks. I mean, you can't think of an artist that has a greater sense of desire in her work, however reduced and minimalist it is. And I think that the desire that I choose to identify in my work is that desire to work with artists on that which has not yet been produced. So I have to generate situations of conceptual intimacy in which they will allow me to ride with them into an area where ultimately I'm not even interested in the public dimension of it. I'm interested, that's where I feel happy, if you like, is if I can establish this trust in a project that is as yet utterly unresolved. I can't do exhibitions to order, you know. I have to find a hunch and an interlocutor. But what I do want to say is that I would like to really thank, first of all the members of the public who came to this debating chamber tonight, those who have remained behind their names, who I know, and equally all of you speakers, the provocateurs and the saboteurs, for their brilliant interventions. And then I would like to thank the faculty of the MMU, because it's incredibly exciting to try and think of how we can go forward with this extraordinary website. And I would like to draw your attention to the next debating chamber, which will happen on November the 22nd on a Wednesday at 7 o'clock in the evening. This time because it was longer, because we had to introduce and wanted to launch the website. And the next session is on the question of figureheads and emancipation. So for a younger artist today, or even for an older artist, who were the figureheads that catapulted you into a form of, that catapulted you into art practice? And at what point did you feel you could pull away from what you were being taught and devise your own idiom? This could be very different for a young artist in 2023 than it was in, let's say, the 80s or the 90s. Could it be that today we're not looking at figureheads as individual artists? We're looking at movements, we're looking at identifications, we're looking at problems areas. And that's what we're going to talk about. It's I hope you will come. There will be Annika Larsen, artists. There will be the curator Juliette Desorgues, and hopefully we will also have Abbas Zahedi, in the house, in the chamber, so to speak. So on that note, a big thank you to everybody, and thank you to Linus, who has been behind the scenes and making sure that everything runs smoothly. Thank you, KW. Thank you. Thank you.